Well, I'm sorry, I just cannot avoid the obvious cliche to say it's been a long and winding road that we've traveled down to track the music of Paul McCartney through the decades. Here are his albums recorded and released in the 60s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, in the decade of the 2000s, in 2010. Wow, that's a lot of music. And now as we start his 7th decade in music, we now turn to what starts with the year 2020. You ready? Then let's drop the needle. Now, before we get started, I will apologize if you hear the air conditioning hum in the audio in the background. At the start of 2020, Paul is 78 years old, and he's still rocking. But the year 2020 throws a kink into Paul's plans. In fact, it throws a kink into everybody's plans worldwide as COVID-19 rages, and the world goes into a virtual lockdown. And it was during this lockdown that I actually hit on the idea of doing Bernie Drops the Needle. Like me, Paul McCartney is also locked down on his farm in East Sussex, England, where he's converted an old corn mill into a personal recording studio that he calls Hog Hill Mill. And it is here that Paul fills his lockdown time doing what Paul McCartney does best, creating music. In December of 2020, Paul releases the music that he recorded during the lockdown. And basically he plays every instrument himself. And it's reminiscent of the first album he made after he left the Beatles called McCartney. And then a number of years later, he did a second album where he plays everything and called that McCartney 2. So this album he calls McCartney 3. Tracks that I like are Long-Tailed Winter Bird, Women and Wives, Lavatory Lil, Deep Deep Feeling, The Kiss of Venus, Seize the Day, and the closer, Winter Bird, When Winter Comes. The album's a huge success in the UK, reaching #1, making it Paul's first #1 solo album in the UK in 31 years since Flowers in the Dirt. In the US, it hits #2. As a result, Paul became the first artist to have a new album at the #1 or #2 slots in each of the last 6 decades. And then a year later, Paul releases a remix album of McCartney 3, which he calls McCartney 3 Reimagined. And what Paul said he did, and I was really skeptical when I heard about this record, but Paul said he did, is that he called up friends, fans, and new acquaintances to record versions of the songs on McCartney 3. What I really like to do is play a track from McCartney 3 and then play a track from McCartney 3 Imagined and see how those two tracks are different and the different artists interpret them different ways. Tracks I like are Find My Way featuring Beck, The Kiss of Venus by Dominic Fike, the terrific Women and Wives featuring a soaring St. Vincent, Phoebe Bridgers doing Seize the Day, and Deep Deep Feeling by 3D RDN. The album did really well, becoming the first remix album to top Billboard's charts in over a decade. Then later in that same year, Paul does something that's not literally releasing music, but boy, it's a great resource for any Paul McCartney fan to have. The book that came out is called The Lyrics, 1956 to the Present. The book contains Paul's thoughts on 151 of his songs. And in that same year, there's another project that gets a new treatment because of COVID. Peter Jackson had been working on a new version of what was the Let It Be movie, which he was calling The Beatles Get Back. So it was to be a theatrical movie to be released, but with COVID, that was not possible. As Peter Jackson was in lockdown, like the rest of us, he decides to keep tweaking with that footage. And he had hours and hours and hours of the original footage shot by Michael Lindsay Hogg for the first movie Let It Be that had never ever been seen. It was aired on the Disney Channel over 3 consecutive days. And over the first 4 days of its release, it had been streamed 503 million times. In April of 2022, Paul decides to announce his Get Back World Tour. and it includes him playing at the Glastonbury Festival a week after he turned 80 years old. Then in August of 2022, Paul decides to release a box set which includes McCartney 1 from 1970, McCartney 2 from 1980, and McCartney 3 from 2020. And now he releases another massive box set. These are all singles. It contains 80 7-inch vinyl singles, originally released between 1971 and 2020. The physical package was limited to about 3,000 units, and it sold out immediately. In 2023, Paul releases another book. This is called 1964, Eyes of the Storm. And this is a photo book, and the photographs were taken by Paul McCartney in 1964 at the height of Beetle mania. At the end of 2023, a single is released, and it's billed as the last Beatles single. It was a demo that John Lennon had recorded in 1977, a home demo, and it was 2 cassette tapes that were labeled For Paul. And after Lennon was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1994, Yoko gave those 2 cassettes to Paul. And on those 2 cassettes were 4 songs. The surviving Beatles got together with Jeff Lynne and decided they would try to clean up these tracks, add some new material to it, and release them as part of the anthology project. And so they did that with Free as a Bird and Real Love. Now, by the time Anthology was being worked on, Grow Old With Me had come out on a Lennon album that had been released after his death. So the other Beatles decided they would not tackle that one. They did try to tackle Now and Then, but the audio quality of that recording on that cassette was so abysmal, they couldn't figure out any way to get it to work. So they shelved the project. And after Peter Jackson did his magic at separating the instruments from the voices and things in the Get Back documentary, he was approached to try to do the same thing with Lennon's demo on Now and Then. And he did an excellent job. And then Paul and Ringo recorded new parts to go onto the song, and they incorporated some of Harrison's guitar playing from when they first tried to tackle it years ago. And as a result, Now and Then was released. It was a hit, reaching #1 in both the UK and the US. It's the first Beatles song to do that in 54 years, since the Ballad of John and Yoko. Then at the start of 2024, Paul releases another album that when I first heard it, I went, what? It was part of the Band on the Run 50th anniversary. Now, I can understand repackaging Band on the Run for its 50th anniversary, but as part of that, this other album that I'm talking about was called Band on the Run Underdubbed. So a couple of questions about this album. What is it about? And is it any good? Well, what it's about is Paul and Linda and Denny Lane had gone to Lagos to record Band on the Run in a studio there that was in horrible, horrible shape. So they just recorded the basic tracks. And then they brought those basic tracks back to London. And in London, they did a process called overdubbing, where they add layers of more guitars or orchestra or horns or whatever is appropriate to finish the song. Well, when Paul was putting together the 50th anniversary of Band on the Run, he discovered those basic tracks, decided to call them underdubs since they didn't have the overdubs. So that's what the album is. Now, is the album any good? And surprisingly, the answer to me is yes, it is. Because we all know those songs by heart. And when you listen to underdubbed, you find yourself in your mind creating the orchestral overdub or the guitar part that's not there. When you compare the underdub versions with what came out on the final album, it's really interesting to hear how those classic tracks were created. But Paul keeps going back to the vaults and keeps finding things that he thinks, oh, this would be great to release. So he puts out an album, and it's called One Hand Clapping. Now, this album is over 50 years old, had never been heard until now, and it was recorded by Wings in Abbey Road in 1974. The concept behind this album was that Paul wanted to take that idea that he originally had when they were trying to do Get Back and have the band rehearse and record and have that all filmed in a studio. So there was a TV documentary that was shot at the same time. Besides Paul, Linda, and Denny Lane, Wings at this time consists of guitarist Jimmy McCullough and drummer Jeff Britton. So we've covered Paul's musical output through the decades. So here's a recap. Here's the albums he recorded in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010, and 2020 to the present. Wow, quite a lot of music. As I record this, I'm still waiting to hear back from Paul saying that he's agreed to do an interview. Hope springs eternal. And if he does, then I'll record another episode and certainly share that with you. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. So now you might think that this is the end, and I should be quoting the song The End, and I thought we would end here as well. But no, hang on. There's going to be more, because I recognized that I missed some Paul McCartney albums. So in the next episode will kind of be like an appendix to this miniseries, and I'll talk to you about those records that I missed. Now, some of you may have already picked up, oh, he missed this one, he missed this one. If you think I missed something, put it down in the comments. Well, thanks, Paul, for a lot of incredible music. And come on, let's do that interview. Thanks for watching, folks, and keep a rockin'. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.